2, and 1.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we have the great pleasure of welcoming Richard Zenith to discuss his new biography, the very first in English, of the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. Recognized, albeit posthumously, as a major figure of literary modernity on a par with Kafka, Borges, Joyce, or Rilke, Pessoa led, on the face of it, a remarkably sedentary life, remaining all of his life in Lisbon, where he was born, if one accepts the 10 years he spent as a child in Durban, South Africa, where he received an English education. He earned his living as a translator for a business company. And while he was not altogether friendless, he had what today's self-help literature might call an avoidant, dismissive attachment style, and very likely remained a virgin his entire life. He died at the young age of 47, shortly before the Second World War, from an intestinal ailment, perhaps pancreatitis, due to excessive alcohol intake. His obituary in the Diario de Lisboa reported that he died, quote, in silence, as he always lived, avoiding publicity and sinking into death in the same discreet manner he had passed through life. And yet, for all this grossly truncated account might suggest, writing a biography of Pessoa might be thought of as something as of a wager. The wager of stitching back together the dissociated fragments of an inner life that was as rich and multifarious as Pessoa's life was outwardly placid and discreet. For there are many Pessoas, perhaps as many as 70 or 80 in fact. Indeed, over the 47 years of his lifetime, Pessoa's self unfolded, branched, refracted into a plurality of parallel identities, some short-lived or barely formed, others with full-fledged biographies, most of them Portuguese, but several English or English-speaking, most, but not all men, most, if not all, writers, including the famous three, Alberto Caeiro, Ricardo Reis, and Alvaro de Campos, all three major poets in their own right. In most cases, these alter egos were not simple pseudonyms. Pessoa called them heteronyms, fully formed alternate identities that sometimes sparred with one another, many of whom acquired such density that Pessoa came to view his own name as nothing more than an orthonym among the heteronyms, the straight or correct name, the magnetic pole for this galaxy of orbiting selves. It gets curiouser and curiouser. Pessoa, the plural poet, continues to evolve and morph posthumously to this day. While during his lifetime he published for the most part in small-run literary journals and released only one book of poetry in Portuguese, the patriotic and quite uncharacteristic Message, he left a trunk full of unpublished writings between 25,000 and 30,000 typed or handwritten sheets of paper, from which his masterpiece, the Book of Disquiet, emerged only in 1982. Scholars continue to pore over this trunk, and it may still yield previously unknown poems, philosophical writings, or random scattered thoughts by Pessoa or one of his heteronyms. Happily, one cannot hope for a more sophisticated and sensitive scholar than Richard Zenith to help us navigate the intricacies of Pessoa's life and work. A preeminent translator and specialist of Portuguese literature and poetry, Zenith has produced numerous editions of Pessoa's work in English, starting with a translation of the Book of Disquiet in its first incarnation known as the Book of Disquietude for Carcanet Press in 1991, to the Grove Press edition of Pessoa's poetry titled Pessoa and Company in 1999 with the great portrait by José de Almada Negreiros on the cover. And that was for Grove Press in 1999, to a translation of selected prose in 2002, a revised translation of the Book of Disquiet for Penguin in 2003, a translation of the Education of the Stoic by one of Pessoa's lesser-known heteronyms, the Baron of Tave, for Exact Change in 2005, and a revised expanded translation of poetry, again for Penguin, in 2006. This is in addition to translations and editions of other Portuguese and Brazilian writers such as Lobo Antunes, Drummond de Andrade, or the Renaissance poet Luis de Camões. Zenith has also organized with the Brazilian poet Carlos Felipe Moises an exhibition about Pessoa for the Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon, which traveled to Sao Paulo's Museum of the Portuguese Language and Rio de Janeiro's Central Cultural Correios in 2010 and 2011. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a PEN Award for Poetry and Translation, a Harold Morton Landon Translation Award, and the prestigious Pessoa Prize. He possesses an uncannily Pessoan last name and has been suspected more than once of being one of Pessoa's heteronyms. Richard Zenith, it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening, and thank you so much for being here. First and foremost, congratulations for this first biography in English. And I think it's fair to say the first in any language to be so thoroughly and patiently researched, uncovering unknown information regarding someone who's particularly protean and elusive, and also putting to rest a number of myths in an already mythologized and self-mythologized existence. So I guess the first question I would have is, as someone with an intimate knowledge of Pessoa's poetry over the years, were there any surprises in this voyage through his lived life that made you reconsider what you thought you knew about Pessoa's work?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Anthony. You did a great job laying the groundwork about who Pessoa was and this enterprise of how he was educated in England in English rather in South Africa for 10 years. But he was born in Lisbon, died in Lisbon, so he was bilingual, and he had this phenomenon of writing under many different names already from a young age, and etc. So he kind of gave a good overall view of that. So with the biographies, surprises, I think my first surprise was how hard it is to write a biography. This is the first time and probably the last time I'll write one. And I thought it would ingenuously that it might take me 3 or 4 years. And that was 13, 14 years ago. What's hard is you have all these pieces that have to go in to the book because they're important. Mm-hmm. And you have to make them fit together somehow. And then there are other optional pieces that you can put in or not. So just getting all of that together, just getting a narrative and everything fitting together is a tremendous amount of work. Then with Pessoa, the problem is aggravated because he didn't have much of a life. As you mentioned, he almost certainly died a virgin. He did have one relationship with a woman, Ofélia Queiroz, that wasn't consummated. After he returned to Lisbon at the age of 17, he never again left Portugal and did not even go much out of Lisbon. He had friends that he saw in cafes, but he was a resolutely private individual. So there's no great adventures. He lived for his writing. So how does one make a story out of all of that? And so there's not that much going on the outside. However, so it did live in a fascinating period. The Portugal, when he was born in 1888, was a stable monarchy. It soon became unstable. And then later in 1910 became a republic, which was a rather dysfunctional republic with lots of fighting going on. And then in 1926, there was a military dictatorship, which then morphed into the Salazar dictatorship that would last for decades. And then when Pessoa lived as a boy in Durban, which was in the English colony of South Africa, Natal, there was the Boer War going on from 1899 to 1901. And so Pessoa was there through that time and witnessed everything that was going on. So all of that is very fascinating background on Pessoa's life, and of course impinges and to a certain extent makes Pessoa who Pessoa is. But what is really going on, or what's really key in Pessoa's life, is his imaginary life. He has an incredibly rich inner life, and so it's a matter of exploring that. And so as far as the surprises of who Pessoa was, I'd say that the greatest surprise is the extent of that imaginary life. I was already aware of that, of course, because I've been working on Pessoa for decades, but getting more and more into the little notes he left. Pessoa's handwriting is very difficult to decipher, and so, as you mentioned, there's still a lot in his archive. There's over 25,000 pieces of paper in this archive, and there's still a lot that has not been transcribed, let alone published. So in that archive, I found all sorts of stuff, and particularly where he writes also about his spiritual search, which was very important in his life, also about his sexuality, and then with that spiritual search, just to give an example, he was very interested, especially in esoteric religions, more so as he got older. Towards the end of his life, he was especially interested. Things like Rosicrucianism, the Knights Templar, the Kabbalah, things like that. He Hermetic traditions. He read voraciously and wrote about all that stuff. But he also created his own orders, and so his own rites of initiation. He would, who was this for? This is just all in his imagination. He wasn't about to go get converts to his religions, but he invented them, and that's quite fascinating.
That's what I think would be so hard for a biographer, because, and you have a beautiful formula. You say that he practiced a form of disconnection from the world that allowed him to live more fully in his imagination, and that is exactly it. So his life was very sort of even keeled, but what was going on in the imagination was of a richness that one can is hard to imagine, and. But then how do you take those writings at face value, or do when you find things in this archive, do you know whether it's a heteronym that has written that, or if it's Pessoa, is Pessoa being serious? Is he fabricating? I would imagine that might have been a pitfall of that you had to navigate around many times.
Well, indeed, you hit on a key issue, and that is Pessoa wrote one of his most famous poems. Begins the poet is a feigner. So the poet is always faking. The poet's always you can never take at face value what the poet says, and indeed Pessoa, one aspect of his heteronyms is that they allowed him to take many different positions on the very same issue. So, for instance, one thing that was going on in the 1910s, a major world event, was the First World War, of course. And one of Pessoa's heteronyms, called Antonio Mora, actually defended the German position. But whereas Pessoa himself defended the Allies, England and France, and so they were at odds with one another. And whenever Pessoa affirms something, you have to really weigh that and okay, that might be what he believed on that particular day. But Pessoa wrote that every intellectual should change his opinion or her opinion every half an hour. So Pessoa was against ever being static, and he was always on the move intellectually and imaginatively, even though geographically he stayed in one place, in Lisbon. And his writing, his poetry and prose, creative prose, or rich sources for Pessoa. It's very autobiographical. However, most often perhaps distortedly autobiographical. So there too, you have to consider carefully before you latch on to something and say, aha, Pessoa was this or Pessoa was that. Pessoa was very rarely anything for very long.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I want to read an excerpt from a review in the New York Times by Barul Sego, that gets at this issue. Let's see. It says, mammoth, definitive, and sublime, Richard Zenith's new biography, Pessoa, gives us a group portrait of the writer and his cast of alternate selves, along with a perceptive reading of what it meant for Pessoa to multiply, or did he fracture like this? What problems did it solve and invite? Zenith has written the only kind of biography of Pessoa truly permissible, an account of a life that plucks at the very borders and burdens of the notion of a self. Was Fernando Pessoa the original heteronym? Zenith reconstructs a life with supple scholarship and just the right kind of proportion, applying the right amount of pressure on those formative experiences of childhood, grief, sexual anxiety, and humiliation, early ecstatic encounters with art, never losing sight of the fact that Pessoa's real life happened elsewhere, as for many writers, alone and at his desk. I think that really gets at what's wonderful about the biography is this sort of sensitivity to this kind of balance that you have to strike between sort of removing yourself and understanding that what you're reading is shaped by certain forces, and at the same time allowing for that to happen, and understanding that is a characteristic of the poetry that is true, that is genuine, this sort of fragmentation. Do you think that before we go into the biography proper and the arc of Pessoa's life, do you think that this difficulty is why there have been comparatively few biographies of Pessoa, and only one in Portuguese dating from 1950? And since then, what do you think that is?
Yeah, so 1950, there was this first and today, until this, so far, the only biography written in Portugal. It was, I have to admire that the writer named Juan Gaspar had the vision to write a biography, because in 1950 it was not so apparent to most people that Pessoa merited a full biography. And so this first biographer created a kind of vision of a poète maudit, kind of so like a tortured, damned poet, a kind of like the Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, this kind of a personality who lived without much money and was kind of miserable, drank too much, and so forth. And that was kind of an interesting picture, but not a very faithful picture. And then that stuck. But the problem was that, as I mentioned, Pessoa was very reserved. So it was very hard to figure out who Pessoa was. He didn't write a lot of forthcoming letters. He had a best friend named Mario Sacarneiro, who was also a poet, and who spent a number of years in France. He died young from suicide when he was only 26. But during their correspondence, Pessoa wrote extensively, and those letters might have been quite useful, but they all apparently went out in the trash. They haven't survived. And then other letters, they reveal a bit, but not too much. Pessoa didn't keep many diaries to speak of. He had a couple that he kept just for a few months, and those diaries are also not very revealing. So the sources are a bit hard to come by just to write a biography. And I mean, before actually taking on the biography, I spent many years in the archive uncovering autobiographical material, published an anthology in Portuguese many years ago of autobiographical texts. So and so that was helpful. But Pessoa, I think, is strikes fear would be biographer, because he is so enigmatic and hard to get to it. And I have to say, I spent all these years writing, but until a few years ago, I was doubtful that I was going to come up with something that satisfied me. There's a point, actually, this was early on, when I started writing in the first person, as if I were Pessoa. It was an attempt to get to the heart of Pessoa, because it's not easy.
So let's look at the kind of narrative arc that you trace for Pessoa's life. And before we do that, I should mention that we're going to take questions from the audience at the end of this conversation. So please, if you have any questions, do send them by email to info@192books.com, info@192books.com, and send them early and often, and we'll take them at the end of the conversation. So the narrative arc, you start with Pessoa's childhood and his education in South Africa, which the education in South Africa, Pessoa talks about it himself as a crucial element of his development. And that's in 1888 to 1905. Then you have another section called The Poet as Transformer, 1905 to 1914. So 1905 is when he's back in Lisbon, to 1914, which is a really important year for Pessoa and for the world, of course. Then you have the next section is Dreamer and Civilizer, 1914 to 1925. And finally, the last decade, 1925, 1935, Spiritualist and Humanist. Can you walk us through these broad divisions, and how do you see them sort of follow each other?
Sure. Let me first of all say that one thing that happens in Pessoa is that from very early on, he has a number of different interests. I mentioned his spirituality, also the sexuality that he explores, his interest in politics. Even when he was very young, you know, most kids don't really feel a sense of patriotism, but Pessoa did at a very young age. And so these, and he was also interested in business, in tried to make money, tried to start up businesses throughout his life. They all failed, but he was obsessed with that. And then all of these different interests, and so different intellectual interests, spiritual interests, they all begin at a young age, and they continue throughout his life. And this is also a challenge to the biographer, because it would be easier if he had, you know, a spiritual phase and then had a political phase, you know, and like that. But that's not the case. So you have all these different strands, and so I really saw the composition of this biography as like a fugue, and that is that this various lines of music, these themes that then repeat. They keep repeating, but in different formulations throughout the text. Mm-hmm. So I say all that because there is, nevertheless, certain emphases from period to period, but so I'll explain these 4 phases. Mm-hmm. However, there's a great intermingling through those different emphases all throughout Pessoa's life. Born Foreigner is the title of the first section, and that's the idea that Pessoa, right from the get-go, felt different from everyone else. He was born in Portugal with a loving family, had plenty of aunts and uncles and cousins, although not too many people of his own age. But he felt out of place. So he talks in the Book of Disquiet about in a passage how everybody thought they knew me, but he was different. They didn't really know him at all, and so the born foreigner, this is this strangeness that Pessoa feels at the beginning, and then when he goes to South Africa with his mother, his father died of tuberculosis when he was 5 years old. And his mother, 6 months later, met the man, he was a ship's captain, who would become her second husband. And that in itself was a bit unsettling for Pessoa, because his father died and his mother was, 6 months later, was greatly in love with this second man. So where is love, and where are these affections? How can they change so rapidly? And Pessoa had his paternal grandmother had a kind of progressive dementia, but it wasn't just dementia in the sense of like Alzheimer's. There was some mental imbalance going on, where she'd have these periods where she'd be extremely violent. And she had to be institutionalized a few times. So that was very unsettling for Pessoa. Where was this, the identity, who was this grandmother? Who was the real Dona Dionisia? That was her name. Because sometimes she was quite peaceful and loving, and then other times she became suddenly impatient with everything and everyone and shouting. And then Pessoa goes to Durban, 7.5 years of age. Pessoa's mother's second husband had been a ship's captain, but then he was named the Portuguese consul in Durban. So he changed professions. So that's where they went, Pessoa and his mother, to Durban. And then, of course, he was a foreigner, literally. And he was a very precocious student, quickly learned English. It was at the top of his class, even in writing English, as well as in other subjects. And but his whole experience there was rather a bookish experience. It was in literature. He didn't have a lot of friends. He was very shy. And then he comes back to Lisbon at the age of 17 to go to take a college course that would then become part of the University of Lisbon. And that was in 1905. So that's that first period. Then Poetis Transformer takes us through the next year. And this is a time when Pessoa, he had already invented his first heteronyms in South Africa, who wrote in English. And then when he comes to Lisbon, then a few years later, he begins to invent heteronyms that write in Portuguese. Some still write in English. And there's even one who writes in French. So he writes in these different languages. He begins to get even more interested in politics and writing about politics. And then these heteronyms have special duties. So some are really only write about politics. Some write about, his French heteronym writes about moral issues, moral satires. So he transforms himself into all these others and into this kind of galaxy of writing and his imagination, how he imagines the world. And then finally in 1914, this all explodes with the invention of the main heteronyms. So those are Alberto Caeiro, Ricardo Reis, and Álvaro de Campos. And these three, as you mentioned, Anthony, in your introduction, each one counts as a full-fledged poet. They're full-length books of poetry by these three heteronyms. Not only poetry, Ricardo Reis and Álvaro de Campos also wrote a lot of prose. And so what was that explosion all about? Pessoa had already invented a lot of heteronyms, but previously. But in 1914, something different happens. He manages to completely transform himself so that these heteronyms, these three main ones, have different ways of feeling, very different ways of writing, different ways, different points of view that Pessoa himself does not have. And then he creates this family. They're in dialogue with each other and also with him. And how did this happen? Well, part of it, Pessoa had this tremendous amount of learning. He'd read English Romantics, Shakespeare, and Milton were his heroes. And in English Romantics, we're talking about Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, and so forth. But he also read a lot of French literature, Portuguese literature, and from other languages. So he had this tons of intellectual baggage. He had also read, he discovered when he came back to Portugal in 1905, when he was 17 years old, shortly after that, he came across a small anthology of poems of Walt Whitman, and they made a great impression on Pessoa. However, he wasn't quite ready to take on and be quite like Walt Whitman, who wrote Song of Myself, where the self is really everything. And so Pessoa, read that and was startled, but only in 1914 did this explosion take place. And this explosion being all of that intellectual baggage, all of that learning, then with this spark, which was Walt Whitman. And this that inspired him to just be able to transform and become completely other, and to become many others. So that's the second phase. Then third phase, dreamer and civilizer. Well, there we're talking about Pessoa as a civilizer. Pessoa was quite a pedagogue. He, as I mentioned, was patriotic, but his patriotism wasn't about celebrating how great Portugal is and the Portuguese. It was rather about educating the Portuguese and making them more European in a way, less shut off in the corner of Iberia, and then he also was a civilizer, not only wanting to teach his countrymen and countrywomen how to be in life, but also wanting to be a civilizer of humanity in general. So he had this sense of a mission always. And in all of this, he was very much a dreamer, because a lot of his patriotism and civilizing then ended up taking the form of dreaming. So, for instance, he imagined that Portugal would become a great fifth empire. This was an obsession of Pessoa. And what is the fifth empire? In the book of Daniel in the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of a statue that was made of different materials. And the prophet Daniel interpreted this dream as being various empires. And those empires were interpreted as being Persian, and then Greek and Roman, and there were various ways that people interpreted these dreams, that scholars interpreted them. But then the fifth empire would be the great divine, long-lasting empire. And so that was a bit of a mystery, which then many people would interpret that would be when Christ returns, for instance, would be many Christians would interpret it that way. Well, Pessoa, but actually before Pessoa, there was a priest, Jesuit priest, Padre Antonio Vieira, 17th century, fascinating figure, who was born in Portugal but spent much of his life in Brazil, and who wrote a lot of prophetic texts. And so he is the first one who then presented this idea that the fifth empire would be Portugal. And Pessoa grabbed onto this and expanded it greatly. And so there was this idea that Portugal would become this fifth empire. And he theorized about this and wrote extensively about that. So that's part of his training, and there's a lot of other. Then so that goes on until about 1925, and then spiritualist and humanist. Well, I mentioned before Pessoa's great interest in all things spiritual, and this began early on, but in the last years of his life became much more intense. He read much more closely many books, and wrote a lot about these matters. And he also became more of a humanist. Pessoa was very skeptical of humanitarianism, and never had patience with communism or socialism, but also was against fascism. But he before had been he'd been skeptical of democracy. He was always a bit skeptical of democracy, and as I mentioned, was certainly not a humanitarian. But there's a kind of change happens in his later years, and he begins to realize, well, he begins to become disillusioned with the turn of politics in Portugal, and became very anti-Salazar and against the so-called new state of Salazar, and then began to become more of a little bit of a humanitarian. So there is this humanist element that comes out of Pessoa. So those are how I divided the 4 periods. Pessoa's life.
Well, you also have a very useful table of heteronyms at the beginning of the biography, with a description of each person, when they become active, when they cease to be active in Pessoa's life. And it's exactly as you said, they intermingle, they sort of pop up and disappear, but come back later. So it's very hard to find some sort of evolution in the creation of these heteronyms. But nevertheless, if we try, and maybe this is artificial, but it seemed to me that there are 3 distinct periods in the production of the heteronyms. One would be the period between 1903 and 1910. So when Pessoa was, his late teen to early 20s, when he is very active in creating heteronyms, and many of them are English speaking, like Alexander Search and Charles Robert Anon, and very rich period in new heteronyms at this point. Then there are, of course, the 3 major ones, which you mentioned, who all emerge in 1914, and who will continue to accompany Pessoa throughout his life, especially Alvaro de Campos, who seems to be a very important presence and even bothers his love interest, Ophelia, to the point that she doesn't want to hear from him again. And that's a time when he's very engaged in the literary life of Lisbon, and has these friendships, and is also trying to publish a lot. So giving another writer a voice as a publisher, and also giving a heteronym a voice as a poet. And then in his later life, towards 1929, 1930, in the last decade of his life, it seems like there are fewer heteronyms. They are mostly older heteronyms who maybe come back, or there's just the Baron of Tave and Bernardo Soares, who are associated for a time at least with the Book of Disquiet. And then also the last heteronym is the only female heteronym. It's Maria Jose. For some reason, it just pops up at the very end there. So my thinking there was, it seemed to me that we've talked a lot about Pessoa as being a fragmented self, and sort of a centrifugal self, sort of producing these heteronyms in all directions. But it seems also that he was perpetually in the process of integration, in the process of actually shedding these other selves in order to integrate into a unified voice. And you get the impression that had he lived another 40 years, he died very young, he died at the age of 47. Had he lived another 40 years or so, he might have arrived at some sort of unified identity. Of course, this is complete speculation on my part, but you do see that these heteronyms, which are very distinct from each other, tend to merge over time, and tend to sort of, their voices tend to sort of echo each other. And then something that was written by Pessoa could have really been written by Reis or by Campos, maybe not at the beginning when these heteronyms emerge, but sort of later in life. What do you think of that idea?
I think that's a valid observation. The heteronyms were complementary. So even though they're very different, they say very different things, it's all ultimately Pessoa. And so there is initially this centrifugal force and Pessoa dividing out, fragmenting into many others. And then it's true that towards the end of his life, he then becomes more interested in looking inward and becomes more introspective and wanting to discover if possible who he is, or try to. So there is then it becomes more centripetal, and maybe in a way trying to find some unity. Mm-hmm. Although Pessoa claimed that that doesn't exist, really. Well, the most important line of poetry of Alberto Caeiro, who was supposedly the master heteronym, the master of all the heteronyms, and Pessoa himself, or I say all the heteronyms, of the other two main heteronyms, and Pessoa himself. And the most important line of poetry, according to Pessoa, this Alberto Caeiro, is it was nature is parts without a whole. So nature, and nature really just means life. Everything is parts without a whole. Yet Pessoa was at the same time, in a way, trying to find a whole, or at least himself. And so you do, towards the end of his life, the heteronyms start dying off. For instance, Alberto Caeiro, after 1930, goes silent. So there's 5 more years. We don't hear any more from Alberto Caeiro. Ricardo Reis, there's still some odes. He wrote odes in the style of Horace, but they're short. And as you say, some of them begin to sound more like Pessoa himself. Álvaro de Campos is active right until the very end of Pessoa's life, fairly active. However, thematically, he's quite different stylistically, but thematically, it's a lot of it is about the same things that Pessoa is writing about under his own name. So yes, there is this process that happens.
You have very something that helped me a lot to think about this is something you say about the heteronyms. They are alter egos whom Pessoa, part artist and part analyst, extracted from his own self and closely observed, like a gallery of portraits or of clinical cases. The heteronyms, ingenious vehicles for producing literature, were also paths to self-knowledge. And that resonated with me because there is a sense in which there is a Socratic dialogue almost between Pessoa and his heteronyms, and in which they're helping him formulate his ideas and sort of they provide a soundboard for him to test his ideas in a way. And that's very.
The heteronyms, they were a bit like, sometimes they were sort of like guinea pigs. Yeah. He would create a heteronym. They were experiments. Now let's try this. So he'll for instance, the Baron of Tave was an aristocrat. Well, Pessoa had some aristocratic blood on his father's side and had a certain fantasy of being an aristocrat. And the Baron of Tave also had was a writer, but he was unable to finish anything. In fact, he commits suicide because he's so frustrated because he can never finish his large project. And that's Pessoa. He can never finish his large projects. So he invents this Baron of Tave, and then kind of subjects him to, what would happen if this, that, and the other. Well, the Baron ends up committing suicide. So they were often these almost scientific experiments in being and in living.
Yeah, I think Octavio Paz talks about Kairos and says that he is everything that Pessoa is not and more. So this is sort of the anti-Pessoa in a way that Pessoa needed to create in order to sort of define a relationship of not antagonism necessarily, but sort of a Socratic dialogue where questions could go back and forth.
Right.
So let's talk about the three main heteronyms, and let's talk about that triumphal day of March 8, 1914, when Pessoa describes the arrival of of Cairo as a sort of epiphany, which something that you have looked at very carefully, and you sort of debunk that in your biography and sort of say, well, this description by Pessoa of this epiphany dates from 1935, and at this point he's really reformulating and sort of mythifying what happened. But in fact, so can you walk us through that again? It's such an important part of his mythology.
Sure. Well, in 1914, when these main heteronyms emerge, they emerge fully formed in terms of their voice. They're very distinct one from another. And so Alberto Cairo is like a poet of nature, who wants to see things exactly as they are without philosophy, adding nothing to them. Ricardo Reis wants to see things as they are, maybe, but he's concerned about form, and he's believes in the pagan gods. He's a classicist. So he writes odes in the style of Horace. And then Álvaro de Campos is kind of a futurist in a way when he first emerges. He's the most over the top of the heteronyms. He wants to feel everything in every way possible. That's his motto. And then he becomes more melancholy over time. He's continually dissatisfied. He's the one that's the most, larger than life heteronym. So they're all quite different. However, their biographies, Pessoa would develop over the years, and their when they were born, exactly when they were born, and so forth, and developed somewhat detailed biographies about them. So this so-called triumphal day, so in a letter he wrote in 1935, claimed that on the 8th of March, 1935, that Cairo appeared. Alberto Cairo, that's this poet of nature, suddenly appeared in him, and he wrote more than 30 poems standing up at a set of dresser drawers. He wrote all these poems at one go. And well, we know that's not true from the manuscripts, because there are manuscripts of Alberto Cairo that are dated a few days before, some a few days after. However, the essence of the story is true. It was probably in maybe about a 2-week period that he wrote about 30 poems in the name of Alberto Cairo. And so there's often Pessoa does mythologize his own achievement. However, there's usually some poetic truth, behind these claims.
And what's interesting about that day too is that he has this sort of speaking in tongues moment when Alberto Cairo speaks through him, and he writes these 30 odd poems, and then that allows him in turn to write his own poem, Slanting Reign, which is one of his most famous poems. And he explains, he describes it in this later letter. He says it was the return from Fernando Pessoa / Alberto Cairo to Fernando Pessoa alone, or better still, it was Fernando Pessoa's reaction to his own inexistence as Alberto Cairo, which is a fascinating formulation, which you sort of have to wrap your head around. But it speaks to that idea that the heteronym is a sort of an intercessor that allows Pessoa to find his voice, in the sense that there's a game of there's a call and response kind of game between him and his heteronym.
Well, that's a good observation. They certainly play off each other and stimulate each other's writing. And the heteronyms are also a way that they're a path of self-discovery for Pessoa, but also self-expansion.
Yeah.
So, for instance, Ricardo Reis, I said he was this classicist who wrote these odes in the style of Horace. Well, if Pessoa did not have that fiction, he never would have written, 200 odes, some in the style of Horace. But he had this fiction, this invented person, and who at a certain point of view, and that was very fruitful for Pessoa to be able to write. And the same goes for Alberto Caeiro, poet of nature, or for Álvaro de Campos, who's the more urbane, citified poet. Yeah.
So we're going to run a little bit late, but I think it's important to read some of Pessoa's poetry, or his heteronyms poetry, specifically Caeiro, I think, who is most fascinating because he's least similar to the others. So maybe do you want to choose a poem of Caeiro's to read for us?
Sure, I kind of pre-chose a few poems here, okay, in case we would want to hear them. So this one is Caeiro's main work was called The Keeper of Sheep. There's 49 poems in The Keeper of Sheep. This is the 9th one. I'm a keeper of sheep. The sheep are my thoughts, and each thought a sensation. I think with my eyes and my ears, with my hands and feet, my nose and mouth. To think a flower is to see and smell it, and to eat a fruit is to know its meaning. That is why on a hot day, when I enjoy it so much, I feel sad, and I lie down in the grass and close my warm eyes. Then I feel my whole body lying down in reality. I know the truth, and I'm happy. Now, this poem is interesting. It helps to explain why this book called The Keeper of Sheep. The very first poem in the book begins, I've never kept sheep, but it's as if I kept them. So according to his biography, Alberto Caeiro did live in the country, but he was not a literal keeper of sheep. But it's as if he kept sheep. But so Pessoa is a lot about that as if. I think it's just key, because Pessoa is very much things aren't necessarily true, but it's as if they were true. Everything in Pessoa is kind of as if, and this is this imagination where he's this dreamer. Mm-hmm. So this poem that I just read explains that the sheep are his thoughts. So he's a keeper of thoughts. But then the thoughts are not your typical thoughts. The poem says each thought is a sensation. So we're not talking about intellectual thoughts. And so he says, I think with my eyes and my ears, and with my hands and feet and nose and mouth. So Alberto Caeiro is all about sensation and about direct perception of the world around us. And the first person to translate Fernando Pessoa in a big way into English was an American monk, Thomas Merton, who was in his own right a fine poet. And he translated some poems from The Keeper of Sheep of Alberto Caeiro, and he commented on their Zen quality. So he compared them to Zen Buddhism. He had a keen interest in Zen Buddhism.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also the the vocabulary is very, there's no ornamentation in Cairo's poetry. It's a very sort of simple, down to earth, unaffected kind of language, no attempt at rhyming, and also a kind of a refusal of intellectualizing anything. It's really a poetry of presence, of full embodied presence through the senses and not through the mind. And he says somewhere else, he says, things have no meaning, they exist. Things are the only hidden meaning of things. So there's nothing behind or above or the of reality of the world. The world is the world, and that's the hidden meaning of it, is that, which is such a radical thought in a way, for especially for a poet who's playing with concepts and with words, to really insist on the fact that the senses are our main gateway to the world and not anything else.
Yes, yeah, he denies this separation between the outer and the inner. So he's superficial, if you will, but superficial is what there is, what exists, what's real, what's life.
Yeah. Shall we jump to Ricardo Reis and hear one of his odes?
Okay. So as Anthony indicated, Alberto Cairo does not rhyme, and nor does he keep a regular meter. Ricardo Reis does not rhyme, but he does keep meter. And as I mentioned, he writes in odes in the style of Horace. So this is a short ode, which goes like this. The gods grant nothing more than life. So let us reject whatever lifts us to unbreathable heights, eternal but flowerless. All that we need to accept is science. And as long as blood still throbs in our temples and love does not shrivel, let us endure like panes of glass, transparent to light, pattered by the sad rain trickling down, warmed only by the sun and reflecting a little. So here you can hear this idea of Horace, of accepting the things as they are, accepting your life as it is, not having great ambitions, and just making the best. There's a kind of a resignation in Ricardo Reis. So the gods have given us what's here, and it's useless to try to strive for more than what's here. So yeah.
And we're panes of glass. We're transparent to light, and we reflect a little, formed only by the sun and reflecting a little. What I find interesting here also is there is an echo of Cairo, in the sense that the gods grant nothing more than life. There is nothing other than life. There is nothing above. There's no unbreathable heights that are eternal but flowerless. But the gods are here. In Ricardo Reis, there is a paganism, or he very clearly does not say God grants us nothing more than life, but the gods. They're sort of the forces of nature, or something neo-pagan like that.
And I really like it, the very last word in the poem. He says, pattered by the sad rain trickling down, we're like panes of glass, pattered by the sad rain, warmed only by the sun and reflecting a little. Mm-hmm. That little also is I don't even know quite how to articulate why I find that so striking and so beautiful. Mm-hmm. But I think it is, yeah.
So now if we move to Alvaro de Campos, we're back in the city. We're in the middle of streetcars and cafes. We're in the modern world. It feels very much like Italian futurism. He talks about machines. He talks about the noise of machines. And it's also very Whitman-esque, as you mentioned earlier. There are passages that sound exactly like, let me see if I can find something here. To feel everything in every way, to hold all opinions, to be sincere, contradicting oneself every minute, to annoy oneself with absolute open-mindedness, and to love things just like God. Sounds very much like Leaves of Grass, in the sense this sort of embrace of everything and contradiction and self-contradiction.
Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, Alvaro de Campos was wanted to eat the whole world, take it all in, be everything, and very strong in his poetry. He's the most dramatic of the Heteronyms.
Mm-hmm. Is there a shorter poem that we might read to sort of grasp his?
Sure. Well, he has this early on. He writes these long poems, which are also called odes in some cases. However, they're not like the odes of Horace. They're another kind of Greek ode. These poems that have hundreds of lines and or encompass all sorts of things and are very exuberant. But then later on, Campos becomes more melancholy and write shorter poems. So here's a short poem from later Campos. I'm beginning to know myself. I don't exist. I'm the gap between what I'd like to be and what others have made me, or half of this gap, since there's also life. That's me, period. Turn off the light, shut the door, and silence that shuffle of slippers in the hall. Leave me alone in my room with a vast piece of myself. It's a shoddy universe. There's a lot of, that second line I read, I'm the gap between what I'd like to be and what others have made me. There are a lot of gaps in Pessoa. You find that word, or others like that word, gap, interval, interlude. So it's always this in-betweenness. So it's always in flux or between one thing and another.
Yeah, the self as gap, or even as half of this gap, because
exactly. Yeah.
And if the first sentence looks simple, but it's actually quite amazing. I'm beginning to know myself. I don't exist. If you think of know thyself as kind of the cornerstone of Greek philosophy, and knowledge of the self is where you start for any kind of knowledge. You have to start with know thyself, and Pessoa turns this on its head and starts with a radical non-existence in a way. This is where, or not Pessoa, but Campos. It's so hard to keep them straight in.
Right. Well, and then you can think of that when he says, I don't exist. I mean, if you think about that too, I don't exist. So maybe there is maybe a kind of self, but it's not I. It's not that I you think is you.
In a Rambo kind of sense.
So there's all kinds of ways to think about that.
Yeah. I love the last line. It's a shoddy universe, because it makes me think of the gap, like a door that doesn't close properly, and then there's something shoddy about it. There's a gap. There's always something that's inadequate or that's deficient. It's a very strange formulation. It's a shoddy universe in which to end a poem.
Yeah, in the original, that word is barato, which a lot of people will recognize also from Spanish, same word, which could be translated cheap. Mm-hmm. But it can have this meaning of cheap that doesn't cost much, or cheap quality. Mm-hmm. It seems to me here the idea of shoddy captured the sentiment.
And what about Pessoa's own poetry, the poetry that he wrote under his orthonym? Could we listen to one of those?
Sure. Like an astonishment in which my childhood survives, I still have half my enthusiasm, mine because I had it back then. I sometimes feel embarrassed to believe so much in what I don't believe. It's a kind of dream with reality in the middle. Around its silent center, the sunflower, deceptively pleasing, speaks, yellow and astonished by the black center that's everything. This poem is from 1931, and it's quite a pregnant poem, pregnant with meaning, and I'm surprised scholars haven't written extensively on this poem. And even philosophically, I think it's an interesting poem. But he has this astonishment in which my childhood survives, and then says, I still have half my enthusiasm, mine because I had it back when I was a child. Well, we all have, in all of us, childhood survives, of course, in some way, to a certain extent. But this is especially true of Pessoa, because Pessoa had that capacity, which I'd mentioned, to believe as if, to believe in things that, children, they know that the doll is not real, but they can still lose sleep because the doll didn't get its dinner. So they have the capacity to act as if things were true that aren't true. And Pessoa, we lose that, but Pessoa did not. And that's why he was able to have these heteronyms and throughout his adult life. Well, then he said in the second stanza that I read, I sometimes feel embarrassed to believe so much in what I don't believe. And then that's fascinating. So, did Pessoa really believe in all those spiritual things that he read volumes and wrote and spent hours? So I haven't mentioned he was also an extremely proficient astrologer. He cast hundreds of astrological charts, spent hours and hours and hours. Did he believe in astrology? Well, yeah, but he believed so much in what he didn't believe. So, and then he talks about this dream, a kind of dream with reality in the middle, and then has this image of the sunflower in the last stanza. We have this yellow flower, deceptively pleasing. And then it's yellow and astonished, the sunflower, by its black center, which is everything. So you have this kind of black hole, almost in the center. And so there's something kind of sinister there and simply mysterious. And so this reality, you can never grasp, this, which is this black center. So we have everything around it. So it's a very, very, very profound poem, really.
It's an amazing image, and the sunflower speaks. So the sunflower is a poet in a sense, that speaks these yellow petals that are sort of deceptive,
poems, if you like,
around a mute center, which is a fascinating image. And we're come 180 degrees from Cairo, who is, in a sense, as we said, the poem of presence and fully embodied senses. Here we have a mute center,
exactly.
a center that's everything, and everything that's around it is a sort of dream or something that's deceptive. There's a fascinating dialogue between Pessoa and Cairo. I think that is that is just a joy to read. And that figure of the sunflower keeps coming back in the various heteronyms, and always different, always sort of adapted to that particular heteronym. All right, I'm very conscious of time. We could really spend hours on one of these, but let's quickly close with the Book of Disquiet, because we have to talk about this sort of masterpiece. It's sort of an anti-novel, an anti-autobiography, all wrapped into one. He called it a factless autobiography. It has 3 heteronymic authors, Vicente Guedes, Bernardo Suarez, and then Pessoa. It begins a little bit like a novel with a very well-known framing device where Pessoa meets the author in a cafe. He's mysterious, they strike up a conversation, they become friends, and then Pessoa wants to publish his story. So bringing back to that role of the publisher that he's had throughout his life. And then this is where, this is sort of where it sort of falls apart in a way and becomes, and you call it a quintessential non-book. So how do you approach a book like the Book of Disquiet?
Well, as a reader, I think the best way to approach it is to just dive in, and not necessarily at the beginning, because there really is no beginning. Even what Anthony, you just said this, where supposedly Pessoa meets the fictional author in a restaurant, but Pessoa wrote that only a few years after he'd been writing the book. So, and then he also had other possible alternate introductions or prefaces for his book. So this is a book that Pessoa began in 1913 and kept on writing until at least 1934. And he kept going in different directions. Pessoa did not even have a notebook where he kept everything for the book. He would write on whatever piece of paper was handy. So it was, and as I mentioned before, he left over 25,000 pieces of paper. He did, towards the end of his life, gather together in a large envelope over 200 passages for the Book of Disquiet. But then there were a couple hundred other passages mixed up in all the rest of his writings. And he did not always label those passages indicating that they belonged to the Book of Disquiet. Sometimes we know that they did because something mentioned in the passage just makes it very obvious. Sometimes we don't know, we can't be sure. So there's always going to be some doubt about what really belongs to the Book of Disquiet. Also, Pessoa wanted, according to his notes, towards the end of his life, go through and make a selection of everything he had written for the Book of Disquiet, and then try to shape it into some kind of a book. But he never did that. So if he had made that selection, we would have a smaller book than what we have. And who knows what, how it would have turned out. What we have is this fascinating compendium of texts about, there are many themes that run through the book. It changes somewhat over time. However, it becomes more diaristic, let's say, as time goes on. But even in the beginning, there were texts that were very reflective, self-reflective, and like a diary. Actually, there were like two phases. So I wrote a lot from 1913 to 1920, then stopped writing for about 9 years, and then came back to the book in 1929, came back with a vengeance, and wrote about half of the passages for the book in the last years of his life. It's kind of like Pessoa kept was famous for having a trunk where he kept all his writings, and then all that material that was in the trunk is now the Pessoa archives in the National Library of Portugal. And the Book of Disquiet, in a certain way, is a trunk within the trunk, because it's also this compendium disorganized of all kinds of writing and about many different subjects. But what's fascinating is in it is, I think in the Book of Disquiet, perhaps even more so than in Pessoa's poetry, there's this honesty, this examination of himself, or of what a self is, and just looks very incisively and acutely at human existence, and is quite unsparing in his self-analysis. And when we read the Book of Disquiet, we often, I think this is part of its attraction, recognize something we ourselves feel or think, but we're never able to express. And Pessoa was able to express it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think George Steiner talks about the level of self-scrutiny in the Book of Disquiet as being unmatched in any other kind of literature, maybe except for Musil and the Man Without Qualities.
Yes.
In a way, it's interesting to think about it as a perfect book for the digital age, because it's not a linear book, but it's a book that could really happen in sort of a hyperspace situation where you'd be able to jump from one theme to the next theme without prescribed order. So a last question from me, and then we'll jump to the audience. I'm curious about Pessoa's ambition, because he clearly, and you talk about that in the biography, he clearly wanted to shape a voice that was distinctly modern and specifically Portuguese. And he had a very thorough knowledge of Portuguese poetic traditions, and he sort of wanted to contribute to that in a very significant way. But he also published little compared to what was left unpublished in the archive. Why do you think that is? And do you think that his work never reached the level of his ambition, and in sort of way that he was never really ready to publish it? Or do you think there's another reason for this?
Well, I think Pessoa, I think most writers reach a point where they're not totally satisfied, but they let it go and they publish it. Yeah, Pessoa wouldn't do that, and so I think that is one of the main reasons why he published relatively little. Pessoa did, by the way, publish quite a bit in magazines, a lot of poems, isolated poems, and some prose pieces too. But his large projects were almost all of them left unfinished. But we can, I think, in a certain way, his ambition was met because Pessoa wanted to express the inexpressible, as many writers do. And what happens is, through the fragments he left of these works, I think we as readers are then invited to participate and to imagine with Pessoa, and to, in a certain way, complete the work. What I mean is that there are things that cannot be expressed, but that from what Pessoa left, we can perhaps get at it and feel what can't be expressed, and yet in a certain way understand it. And so I think that Pessoa's ambition, if we think in that way, was met.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also Cairo says, I have no ambitions and no desires. To be a poet is not my ambition. It's my way of being alone. I guess we have that voice too, that at least one of his heteronyms did not have the ambition to be a poet, but maybe many others did. All right, Evan, do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, yes, we do. Let me see. So Christopher asks, I find the Book of Disquiet relatively interchangeable with Freud's interpretation of dreams. My question for Richard, do we know if Pessoa read Freud? Okay, so that's the first question. And you do talk about Freud in the biography, so that's an interesting...
Yeah, that is a good question. I doubt that Pessoa read interpretation of dreams. Pessoa confessed in a letter that he did not read, had not read tons of Freud. He did read Freud's book on, he had it in a French translation, Freud's book on Leonardo da Vinci. And he read that in the late 1920s. However, he did read about Freud secondhand. He knew about Freudian theory and sublimation and so forth. So he was familiar with that, and so it did have this capacity for seizing rapidly without. So even in philosophy too, very often whether Kant, Hegel, and so on, he didn't necessarily read their work deeply, directly, but he was rather capable of reading a bit, sometimes secondhand, and really getting at the essence. So with Freud, I think he had a good understanding of basic Freudian doctrines, but it does not seem that he read the interpretation of dreams.
Again, another question on the Book of Disquiet. Michael asks, in the Book of Disquiet, Pessoa writes, "Let us absurdify life from east to west." How did absurdity serve Pessoa beyond perhaps severing the connection with what most of us take to be reality, our common sense?
Yes, Pessoa, with absurdity, Pessoa was always questioning reality. He was always questioning received ideas. He was always trying to shake up other people and the Portuguese especially. So he was provocative, and so his absurdifying had to do often with that, and to see things from many positions. He was fond of paradoxes and formulating paradoxes, and he was profoundly aware of these enigmas in life and the absurdity of simply of living. If you know you're going to die, and so I had a very keen awareness of death from a young age because of his father's death, and he also had a little brother who died when he was just 1 year old. And the very first sonnets he wrote in English were about death. Okay, so if you have this strong awareness of death, as so it did, but you live anyway. Your life is just an absurdity to deal with suffering and so forth. What we do. So that was but then the act of absurdifying of life went hand in hand with his awareness of latent underlying absurdities, I guess.
There's a question about Portugal which I'd like to ask you, because we didn't get to talk about Pessoa in Portugal, and it's such an important, the move from the monarchy to democracy to the Salazar regime, and Pessoa's role in or perspective on all of this is fascinating too. But Stephen asks, Pessoa is huge in his home country. Are there any Portuguese writers who've taken up the mantle from him, so to speak? Or is he such an idol as to be untouched by the writers who followed him? And are there, follow-up question, are there any contemporary Portuguese writers you particularly admire?
Well, yes, there's in some years ago, there was an expression that went around, particularly among Portuguese writers. They were a bit tired of hearing about Pessoa. Maybe they felt there was too much attention maybe on Pessoa and not enough on them, on other contemporary writers. So there was this expression, tanto Pessoa já enjoa, so it rhymes. So it means so much Pessoa, we've had enough. It's nauseating. And so writers taking up the mantle, it's a hard act to follow, Pessoa with all those heteronyms. So I think Portuguese writers, rather than taking up the mantle, have perhaps, of course, many are, particularly poets, are clearly influenced by Pessoa in different ways, or sometimes by a particular heteronym of Pessoa, such as Álvaro de Campos. And however, by and large, I believe that they've tried to distinguish themselves from Pessoa and to find their own individual voice, rather than take up the mantle, as it were.
Mhm.
So as far as Portuguese writers that I admire, well, I think particularly in poetry, that there's quite a strong tradition of good writing in Portuguese and in Portugal, and in prose also, great writers, whether I don't know, Antonio Lobo Antunes, of course, Saramago, Mário de Carvalho is another, Lydia Jorge. There's many, and there's many poets that I admire. I mean, in the 20th century, and there are a number of young poets too.
Another thing we didn't talk about is how to approach Pessoa through other writers, like Saramago, for example, who wrote the Ricardo Reis book, and another one that I particularly like is the Italian writer Antonio Tabucchi, who wrote in Italian and in Portuguese, and was a lover of Portuguese culture and very lover of Pessoa's work in particular. So there's a way here to, I think Pessoa's work sort of reverberates in so many ways, not only in Portuguese literature, but in modern literature in general.
Yeah, I mean, it might almost be that easier for Pessoa to reverberate it in other languages, because in a certain way they're not competing in the same tradition,
Mm-hmm.
Rather than in Portuguese language. Yeah.
Okay, one other question. Francisco asks, in the book of Disquiet, Pessoa defined his poems as childish. What could be hidden behind the statement? Were his poems a soft way of expressing harsh ideas?
Would you repeat the first part of the question? That he
in the book of Disquiet, Pessoa defined his poems as childish. What could be hidden behind the statement? Were his poems a soft way of expressing harsh ideas?
Okay. Well, we have to distinguish between Bernardo Soares and Fernando Pessoa. Mm-hmm. So the Book of Disquiet is indeed often autobiographical, but there's a character, Bernardo Soares, who is kind of like Pessoa in some ways, but even more reserved, more shy, keeps to himself, kind of a lesser Pessoa in many ways. And he was a prose writer, so he talks about having written poems that, but he doesn't think much of his own poems. And this really seems to be, and he celebrates in one passage why he explains why he prefers prose, and how prose can include everything, including the rhythms of poetry. So you don't need poetry. And so this is Bernardo Soares. However, it can apply to Pessoa in a certain moment, in a certain angle, a certain way of thinking of Pessoa. But Pessoa was very much a poet as well as a prose writer. Yeah.
All right, I have a kind of esoteric question that has to do with reading Pessoa today, because it seems that we are at a historical moment, at least, where there are a lot of bodies and souls that are experiencing some form of migration of the self. You can think of migrants, you can think of refugees, and you can think of trans people who are sort of whose identity is migrating as well, and they are born foreigners, just in a way that you talk about Pessoa too. Do you think that reading Pessoa today resonates differently in this kind of historical context, where we're experiencing so much migration and fluidity of in the realm of identity?
That's a fascinating question. And I hadn't really thought of it, but I think that yes, Pessoa was, he talks about in his, when he analyzed himself in spiritual terms, but he talks about the female side and the male side. And a few times, and there's this ambivalence and ambiguity in Pessoa that's sexual and operates at other levels too. And then even he uses this language too, and he describes the heteronyms. Well, there's Álvaro de Campos, in some notes that he wrote, talks about Ricardo Reis, and he says that Ricardo Reis, when he met Alberto Cairo, this is all, fictional, and they supposed to meet each other, and then Alberto Cairo was the master, and then contact with the master then changes them, right? So according to Álvaro de Campos, when Ricardo Reis met Alberto Cairo, he was a man and became a woman, or was a woman and became a man. So he uses this curious analogy to describe the shock. And then he uses it even with himself too. He says that he was, when he met Alberto Cairo, that I can't remember exactly how it goes, but something to the effect that he lost the virginity he had or something. So it's a sexual thing going on. And then beyond, when Pessoa talks directly about things sexual, in all of Pessoa, there's this constant ambiguity and ambivalence, and the shifting and the shifting of identity, and nothing is ever quite what it seems. I think Pessoa would be highly relevant for this kind of personal migration. And then as far as migration, geographical migration, sure, why not? Also because Pessoa had these very different experiences in different languages and cultures.
Well, I think we could go on and on and on, but we have to end it here. And I can guarantee anyone listening that we barely scratched the surface. So you should run and get Richard's book, which is coming out, or has come out and can be purchased at the bookstore. A recording of this event will be posted immediately afterwards. So if you missed the beginning, or if you want to share it with a friend who you think would like it, it'll be ready in just a minute on our page. And all our previous events are available to watch as well. If you'd like to purchase Richard's book or reserve it, you can send us an email at info@192books.com. And you can also come to the shop every day from 11 to 6 until 7 on Fridays and Saturdays. You can also order from our bookshop page, that's bookshop.org, for direct shipment if you can't make it down to Chelsea. As far as future events, we're taking a little summer break for the next few weeks, and we'll resume our events in September. So in the meantime, please sign up for our email newsletter or check our website, 192books.com, to keep informed about what we're preparing for the fall. Richard, thank you so much for your generosity and for this wonderful conversation. And to everyone listening, thank you very much and good night.
Thank you.